what is the future? It kind of is, for whom's sake is this for? you know, I think there's a lot of discussions on the question, but not particularly any strong claims of where to go forward in it. While true in one sense is not true in another. You know, there are distinctional differences. Let me put it this way. Like, if we want design to be any kind of capacity of power in the world, is really, in my opinion, to give design the authority to have any kind of power in the marketplace.
Welcome to another episode of the DESIGN Podcast. Today's guest, Thomas Jockin. Thomas is the founder of TypeThursday. He's also a lecturer at City University of New York, Queens College, City College, and previously at State University of New York Fashion Institute of Technology. He is a practicing typeface designer with clients such as Google, Starbucks, Coca-Cola, Foot Locker, and Express. Thomas has received his BFA in Communication Design from Parsons School of Design, the new school, and his Postgraduate Certification in Typeface Design from Cooper Union. Thomas and I talk about design education having authority, the constant flux, the critical skill set of typography, how more methods and more theory doesn't really work. We also talk about design programs keep adding more and more, creating students that are less prepared. Also, we discuss, while we need to create good designers, we also need to create better people. Thomas and I have a great conversation about all these things and so much more. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Thomas, welcome to the DESIGN Podcast. How are you?
Peter, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Excellent. We're glad to have you. And to set the record straight from now on, for the rest of the podcast, I'm going to be calling you Tom. We've had a brief discussion pre-podcast as we're preparing, and I'm like, what is it? Is it Thomas, Tom, TJ? You know,
I go by many names based on who I know.
Many names. Excellent. For sake of simplicity, I'm going to use Tom, and everyone will love it. It'll be great.
It'll work. That's great.
So tell me a little bit about your background. I know that you're involved a lot in New York City with the design community, with typography, the type community, and also teaching.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it depends how far back you want to go. I mean, I graduated from Parsons for my undergrad.
Okay.
BFA in Communication Design. I met a type designer named Joshua Darden in my sophomore year. I studied under him for about 2-3 years at Darden Studio. Then in 2010, I was in the inaugural Type A Cooper program, extended. So it's a 1-year program, a postgraduate degree. And then ever since 2011-12, I've been an independent type designer since then. And,
fantastic.
Yeah, and then one of the projects that came out of that was TypeThursday. It's a monthly meetup around the world in 8 cities, 4 United States, 4 international, where people meet once a month. They show work in progress, what they're working on. They get dialogue from the audience and how to improve that work. And then they get, both the audience and the presenter gets actionable direction on what's typography, how does it work, and the diversity of things we could produce with it, all the way down from type design all the way to the highest levels of branding, advertising, and political activism.
Oh, that's fantastic. You know, I must admit, I'm extremely jealous that there's not a Type Thursday close to me. And I remember speaking with you at one of the TypeCons. I'm like, man, I've got to get that near me. And at that time, I was just 2 hours north of Indianapolis, 2.5 hours south of Chicago. I'm like, well, there might be an opportunity maybe in Indy to kind of get this going. But I've since relocated now to central Arkansas and a little bit more remote. I don't know if there's that many passionate type lovers in the Little Rock, Arkansas area, but, you never know.
That's that's actually a big theme in Type Thursday because it's a democratic group in the sense that we don't have like the professional experts coming to present, right? You'd be surprised what communities can produce, right? In terms of when they come together, mainly because type is so diverse in terms of its applications. So you never know. I understand your concern. I think it's perfectly valid. But the world's a lot bigger place than we know. And we always can be surprised if we open ourselves up to it.
Well, maybe we'll touch base on that then in a couple days or weeks coming up here as we get ready for the fall academic semester to get started. I'd love to have something like that in my repertoire of feathers in the hat, So you're teaching as well.
I am, yes.
Yeah, busy. Okay, tell me a little bit about your teaching then.
Yeah, so I've been an adjunct in the CUNY and SUNY systems for 4 years now, maybe 3, something like that range. For those who don't know, that's the City of New York system and the state of New York system. They overlap each other.
Yeah.
So my main home base is Queens College in Flushing, Queens. That's where I teach in the design program. But I've also taught at City College, where I teach in the summers. And I've taught in FIT, Fashion Institute of Technology, type, and actually very excitingly, I'm teaching graphic design history in the fall. So
Oh, wow.
the range of things I actually teach are quite broad. It goes from type design to typography 1 and 2, graphic design 1 and 2, to graphic design history going forward.
Right, because that's what your, I guess I'll call it traditional BFA degree is. It's a communications graphic design foundation. So you've always had that, and plus you've worked in the industry prior to just going solely type design, correct? That's what you're at now, like pure type design, or are you still doing other?
Yeah, since 2012. Yeah, so my clients have been like Starbucks, Foot Locker, Express, working on commission projects for type.
That's it always excites me, but it also amazes me that you can have a full-time career just creating type, So it's a beautiful world. I'd appreciate some of that as well. That'd be fun.
Well, just to jump on, I just one thing to say that it's beautiful and it's very cool, but it also points out, actually in a lot of ways, how interdependent we are. Because the more specialized you are, actually more you need to rely on others who actually see the value in what you do and have the resources to bring you into the equation. Just being honest in terms of how this works. There's no clients art directors to hire me or creative directors to hire me, then I don't get to do my work.
Right. That makes sense, actually. And do you find yourself when you're teaching, and then I'm going to ask my big question for you, do you find yourself when you're teaching the correlation between your type design and what you speak of in the classroom? I'm assuming so.
Well, could you clarify? Do you mean in the sense of vis-a-vis, like against like graphic design, general graphic design training and type, or just my type design teaching and my type design production? Like which direction?
Yeah. I think I was thinking more broadly, but I guess it's going to change depending on where you're at, which classroom you're in, or do they kind of cross?
They definitely cross. I think as some of my students kind of complain about that everything is type for me. Like it's basically the unit of measure that everything is put against.
I get the same. Yeah, I get that. I get that as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, but see, actually, I challenge them on that on 2 grounds. One is type is the fundamental element that makes design. That's the argument I make. So by mastery of that or understanding in that context, you've gained at least the foundation of mastery of the others. Not this, because the other elements are more analogous to art training, formal art training, color, composition, proportion, things like that. Type is the one element that seems to be essentially unique, the difference between what design training gives you and everything else does. So to answer that question, as a setup, how they relate. Well, first of all, one is the big reality that type is meant for a purpose. It has a use, and it's very easy in the type trainings, if you just isolate yourself in that, to just treat type as just for its own sake, being beautiful for its own sake, when there's value in that, and we can definitely evaluate type in that context. It's always also for an end, for some purpose. And that is what general graphic design does with it. And it does it for some purpose or end. So any type you're producing really only gets evaluated and used well by others. So that's a big revelation I've seen from teaching, and very beneficial. And I actually encourage a lot of people who are into type to do that, kind of have those kind of cross dialogues. It's really important.
Yeah, I actually love that answer, because I'm, of course, a passionate type lover too. I've designed a few typefaces. They're rudimentary and barbaric, at what they are, but nonetheless, I accomplished the feat. Yeah, I climbed the hill and I made it happen. But you're completely right, and that's kind of the same thing I talk to my students about. I'm like, what is graphic design? It's the communication of a message using type and image. Type and image. And if you don't understand letter form, even from the minuscule of a 2D application, because it's just line creating shape, add some color, and so on and so forth, it's do you understand the basic form? And then we can talk about rules, and then we could talk about breaking the rules, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I completely agree. And I think there's many programs out there where I see the lack of concentration in typography, unfortunately. They have their type classes and they have some folks teaching type, but it's not as strong as it could be sometimes. So with that kind of interlude, what do you think is the state of design education today?
I mean, I think it's clearly in flux. That's basically, if I had a theme, it's flux. And it's how best to put this? I think it's in flux, and in terms of what direction we end up in is indefinite at the moment. I think there's a lot of discussions on the question, but not particularly any strong claims of where to go forward in it. So for example, just one point, and by the way, I mean, also I want to be very clear, what even is design, or what even is permitted in the conversation is, you've had in previous episodes, I've watched previous episodes of yours, and this is an open question. The analogy between like making products and what communication is, while true in one sense, is not true in another. There are distinctional differences, and maybe you can argue that that's overlapping, right? In fact, actually, I think in a lot of cases it is. I mean, one great example is the Apple team. I mean, I believe Jonathan Ives was a product person, and he had complete dominance over typographic and other user interface decisions to some disastrous points, right? The Helvetica New Light movement phase. Yeah, exactly. So that's a clear issue. So I need to. That's kind of revealing a very important part. Is what is the future? It kind of is for whom's sake is this for?
Ooh, okay, yeah.
Because let me put it this way: like if we want design to be any kind of capacity of power in the world, meaning in the sense, like, for example, we hear a lot of discussion about design ethics, Mike Montero, all this kind of stuff. We're making claims like design has some ethical component to it, that we have some capacity, we have some ethical standards we have to work within. Now, normally this always gets turned into some kind of utilitarian, what is the right action? Don't steal cigarettes. Don't do things that steal people's privacy. But that's a rather narrow sense of thinking about ethics, because ethics also has a question of what kind of good are we aiming towards, and quite frankly, who has the authority to make the claim this is the right direction and we need to go in this direction. For example, when we use logic to argue with people based on reasoning, even a king has to bend the knee to reason. In that sense, what knowledge do we have in design that has that same degree of force? I don't know. I think a lot. I mean, this is my indictment of the design education system. I think it's a lot of flattery. I think as Plato would comment, that we're a form of rhetoric, and rhetoric's a form of flattery. It doesn't have the same argumentative force that logic has, or his form of logic would have, something like that.
Sure.
Not to say we can't have that. I'm just saying in terms of why is this a problem? Why are we even asking this question? What is the future of education and design?
Right.
Is really, in my opinion, to give design the authority to have any kind of power in the marketplace of making claims in the world and making them realized, and having people quite frankly, consent that we have a valid point. Much like a scientist makes a claim, we bend the knee. They make a claim, and even if it's not actually, if you actually knew the statistical analysis and their methods of analysis, you could start challenging them. But because you don't even have the access to that knowledge, you can't even challenge them. You have to just bend the knee to what they say.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective on that. I kind of like that, and I do appreciate your answer. It's in flux. Who are we serving, and how do we? And I think design education is going to constantly be under change. It's going to constantly have to adjust to the marketplace, to society, to the needs that are either created or wanted of the time. And just kind of thinking about that, are there things that we are doing in design education that we no longer need? Are there things that we need to concentrate more on? So where are we going to start swaying? What things are going to get left behind so that we can continually get those new needs addressed?
It's really complicated because The normal answer would probably be less tools, more methods, more abstraction versus the explicit, but it doesn't really work. One is pragmatically, programs have a technical training they have to give, right? Which requires tools, and tools change. I mean, that's fundamentally why does design education have to change? It's because the tools change. We're not using Quark Express to do layouts.
Right.
I'm old enough to know what that is. I didn't actually use it per se, but I know what it is.
Yeah. It was great for its time, and then it outdid itself, and thank goodness it did, because I'm appreciating what Adobe's doing. And that's a whole nother discussion. As I said in a couple other podcasts, you start talking about software, and that's a whole nother
But the problem is that's kind of looking at the tree is not the forest, right?
Yeah.
Because the software is meant to do something. It's for the sake of producing things. So the question then is, what are we producing? Clearly exactly. I think in terms of what knowledge we actually can contribute to, what we're trying to train our students in, clearly the formal arts are definitely the requirement, because that's one, we need that. We're a part of that circle group of the arts. So as we said, color, composition, proportion, materials, all that kind of stuff is really important, and it still needs to be there. With type being a kind of the main grounding anchor for all of it, from my opinion. But because of that, and because type actually has the capacity to communicate, it opens the window now in terms of what I think needs to be added. And I guess the problem is, like, I'm talking about what needs to be kept or added. I'm not really talking about what's being negated.
Well, that's one of our biggest struggles, and I would say, and then I'll let you continue on where your thought is I do see more and more students graduating less and less prepared, in my opinion. And I know in our program in particular, I would like to see a little bit more upper level classes kind of flushed out a little bit more. But again, we're a small program. We keep our classes small, so and it's also an art program, so they've got other responsibilities and things to work on. So that's even a whole nother struggle between an art dedicated program or a design dedicated program. That separates a little bit too. But continue with what your thought was there. If I didn't derail you too much.
No, you didn't derail me at all. It's just a matter of, like, one is the issue. It's kind of ironic. We're always in this mode of, like, keep adding, yet our students seem to be less and less prepared.
Yes. And you're also answering my other question of art and design, or art versus design. So we're touching on that question as well. Yeah, it's analogous to each other. So in some ways they're exactly the same. In other ways they're very clearly different. You're right.
Let's put it this way. So I think the very fact, if the purpose of, here's the thing, and that's right, because ultimately, to answer this question effectively, we need to answer first the question, what is the end of education? Like, what are we trying to do with these students?
Yes, exactly.
I think one claim mode is to say we're meant to prepare these students for the marketplace, right? Mm-hmm. That's one answer. I think it's perfectly valid. I think most students would argue,
That's like the default,
Yeah, that's the default answer. And we're failing that answer. Like, we're not achieving that.
Yes, we are.
That's the first thing. So clearly things need to change.
Yeah. And to add to that, I think every university, every educational program that's focusing in this area needs to be able to look at their faculty and know what the strong suits are to their faculty, look to their community, look to where they're actually sending their end product, the students, out to work, what those needs are for those students in that area, and work on trying to cater to that. Or the reverse of that is to, where do you want your students to be? What are the needs then? Look back to your faculty. What are the strong suits? So it really has to be designed and planned just as much as any other aspect of it. But
actually, I would say, while that might be the obvious answer, right? The clear-cut one. I really do personally believe there is a larger one. Like, there's actually another one that's not really spoken very often. But I think actually more, in a lot of ways more, I think even more it's the case. It's really to make them more moral people, to be better people. And not just for the fact of they could produce widgets better. Right. That while true and certainly fair, that's not the whole of a human being. right?
I'm glad you brought that up because there's definitely faculty, and we have these discussions in our faculty group that bring this up. So
I think it's valid, but the key is clearly, I mean, man needs to get bread as well as wine, right? Or honey, wherever the expression goes, right? So you need you need those material needs resolved so that you can move on to the higher goods. Perfectly fine. I think that's valid, but it's kind of like if you just focus on that myopic view of preparing for school at graduation, I could challenge you on that immediately in the sense that, okay, the jobs we prepared for 10 years ago are not the jobs we're going to prepare them for 30 years from now. So it doesn't work if you just frame on that alone. You got to aim at something a little more stable as a target.
Point. Right.
You know? So I think ultimately it's being training a new way of seeing in people that they did not have before. I know from my personal experience in education, that is the ultimate giveaway. Like it didn't give me the perfect answer, the perfect perfection of how my life was going to be, but it definitely gave me a new way of seeing. And also equip me with the knowledge and the capacities and the trust in myself to actually go find the answers on my own.
Right. Yeah, that's a big one. I completely agree with that one. I'm going to ask you a question here. We're really kind of talking about design education. So I want to ask you the importance of virtue in education then.
Well, of course, like I said morals. So, of course, I think it's very important to clarify that, the way I'm using morals is the philosophical framing of it, not the Victorian kind of the chastity, keep up oneself to marriage, that kind of thing. Just be very clear. Yeah. I think it's because, like I said, it actually relates to education because. So you said before value professors and assessing them in terms of their strengths. So what they do well, and what one does well is their virtue, as Aristotle would say.
Okay. Yes.
So it's really about affirming what people are excellent at and putting them the ones in the right position who deserve to be there.
Okay.
And cultivating them to become that.
Well, how do you then manage those that maybe aren't there?
Excellent.
I've had a few students over my decade plus of teaching where I've actually asked them, is this exactly what you're seeking? Where is your passion? And I've actually had those students say, well, this isn't really my passion, but I'm here because my parents are paying for college and this seems like something I might do.
Yep. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I because again, on the education question and the virtue, I see is leadership. And a good leader, the first thing you got to do is you got to get buy-in. And the first thing about buy-in as an instrument, as a tool set, like leadership is a tool set, right, of different methods. And one of the major methods is buy-in. And buy-in, you got to get agreed a vision about what you're trying to do, an alignment about what you're trying to do. So, hey, listen, I mean, if I got a student like that, if I got to play the card of, hey, listen, you want to make your students, you want to make your teachers, your parents proud, then this is what you're going to need to do to make them proud. I don't like that because that's very unstable as a source of motivation, quite frankly, but you got to take people what they are, in terms of that question. But in general, though, is finding out what their purpose is. Like, what do they get excited about? What do they focus about? And some of them are more practical than others, and others are for maybe reasons we don't think are the best reasons, but that's not our place to judge. That's their call to make on that. The first goal is just to align, figure out what their goal is. Don't treat students are not like material objects that we get to just manipulate into whatever we want. Because that's the whole point of why they're moral creatures. They're moral entities. So they actually have to have the power of consent. You cannot change them unless they consent to it.
That is very true. Yeah. I
mean, that's the thing. All of us have been in school. If a teacher has the power of a grade, which is obviously one of our methods, but that power only really works if they consent and they think it's worthwhile in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah, because I've had a lot of mediocre students that you're like, gosh, I just wish that you would do better. I know you've got the abilities to do that. But it is when they finally go, oh, wait a minute, just something clicks, whether it's something we've said or something they've done with a project. They're like, wow, okay, this is kind of cool. And then all of a sudden they just immerse themselves in it, and they've committed to learning it, and their grades turn around, their projects turn around.
All it takes is that one moment. All it takes is that one opportunity, that one change, and everything moves in. And what was once so difficult and seemed so arduous becomes effortless.
Exactly.
That's true power. I mean, in terms of education, in terms of like what an educator is, this is why we're leaders, or have the potential to be, because a leader doesn't actually deal with the results themselves. All they do is just line up using their instruments, right? And there's their methods to make that moment happen, and then let the person, the subordinate in different ways, want to move in that direction on their own. You're just there to support them at that point. Exactly.
And I'm not trying to think of fancy language and fancy words, which isn't my strong suit.
That's fine.
I would not be doing any justice if I was to say I've seen this happen in many classes. My point of what I'm getting at is I've seen exactly what we're talking about the majority of the time, and this is not some kind of fast talking stuff to kind of make it all sound great for our conversation with podcast and typography involved.
Yeah.
But I've seen those moments, those changed moments happen in my typography class 8 out of 10 times. I don't know why, but that's where things are like, wow, okay, this is pretty neat stuff. This is really different. This is pretty cool.
Can I give you a thesis why I think that's the case?
I don't know if it's me. I'd like to think it's me.
You're clearly contributing to that, Peter. I would agree with you. Yeah. But I can give you a thesis why I think that is.
Sure. And one of the things I did want to ask you is why typography becomes that in communication design.
Yeah. So the first part about why that revelation seems to happen more often in the type class than in other disciplines or other classes, I think I say this because I experienced this myself. When I met Joshua Darn, the type designer, and I was demonstrated to me this whole reality that I took it for granted, right? Because I only saw letters as method of communication, not as a form. I've heard this before. Mm-hmm. Right? Not as an actual form that has affective causal properties onto people that are separate but parallel with the communication function at exactly the same time. Because within philosophy, that's real understanding is not just intellectual reasoning, right? It has an emotive quality too. To understand something, to grasp it totally, is both an emotive and a rational intellectual activity. And type actually achieves both at the same time. And that is a beautiful thing. And that's why I get so excited about it. Well, that's why I remember literally the first lecture Josh gave, talking about type, I just at 19 was just awestruck at just the intelligence of this man. And I was just like, I was a very stupid person most of my life, but God bless me for at least having the wisdom in the moment of saying like, I want a mind like him. I want to be him, and that's what I mean by virtue, because virtue ultimately is becoming a kind of person. Specifically a good person in this way. And I think typography is a mechanism to allow that when given the right opportunity.
Yeah. So the second half of that question then, I've heard you speak highly of typography a lot, and I've heard you say that typography is first when it comes to communication design. Why do you feel that way? Can you elaborate on that, explain that?
I mean, like I said, first of all, a couple of grounds. One is, on the question of communication, why does communication matter so much? Or why is it like a different activity than from other activities? Running, walking, pushing, building. Why is communication different? Well, first of all, one, it's because we need that for a community. For people to talk to each other, it requires communication, right? And the communication, in terms of, because animals communicate, but as Aristotle says, they communicate what's painful and harmful, right, only. We can do that too, but we also have what is good and bad. What is right and wrong? We actually use communication in moral claims, in moral discussions, right? It's basically what makes us human. That's basically what it's getting at, in that specific sense. So the essentialness of what makes us human beings and makes civilization possible is communication. And that was, in terms of now tying into design, what we're talking about right now, written communication was one of the major revelations of civilization. There is no civilization without writing. And we forget this because it's so common. It's been around for thousands of years. But it actually is one of the major revolutions. I mean, there's a reason why a lot of times people believe, was it in the Times Magazine said the greatest invention ever made was the Gutenberg press. It's just that that's only an acceleration of the original technology, the original innovation of written communication. So I just want to demonstrate why this is so important in terms of its impact, not just and that's why I said before about a power that even a king has to bend the knee to. It's because even kings need communication. That's kind of the point. So if we agree with all that, now leads to the other point. Because this is actually a problem even within if you read Plato, they talk about, the fact you have syllables and they're made of elements, which are letters. But after you can't really describe the element. Well, we can, because we know elements, in this case type, are figure-ground relationships, right? Positive space and negative space in a certain interval relation of both existence and non-existence. I mean, I don't get into it woo-woo, but positive space and negative space. We should put it that way, right? Arranged into certain arrangements. And we know that certain arrangements are done better than others, both for its own sake as well as towards certain ends. And by accepting all those points, we then now have demonstrated the art of typography, right? The body of knowledge that discusses these kind of questions. And once you know that, that's actually the window to get from there. If you're willing to go along with it, ultimately you'll get to higher forms of knowledge, in my opinion, right? Because eventually you're going to start asking, okay, what is this communication for, right? It's actually like a seed within it, and it can lead to a much more intensive understanding. There was a chair in my department at Parsons that I remember I saw a year or two after I graduated, and I told him what my career direction was, type design and all that. And he commented, I never met a dumb type designer. They don't really exist. And I think it's what he's getting.
Interesting,
That's kind of the point he was getting at. Maybe not directly the way to see what I'm saying, but as an analogy.
Right. I think that's awesome. So we're talking about community and being able to communicate on a intelligent level. Empathy. Yeah. So can we unite typography with empathy?
Well, I think we can. And I think the reason why is, so empathy is defined as the ability to understand other people's emotions, right? So you can observe other people's emotions, you can feel them yourselves. Yeah. So there's an idea that the subjectivity inside another human being, we can grab at. That's what's basically being said from a motive point of view. Sorry, pardon me.
No, you're fine. Yeah.
So if I hinted at before, right? If we accept that type, instead of being just this passive thing that just exists, right? And then content just flown into it, instead we accept that type actually has causal properties of affection, meaning they can elicit emotions in people.
Yeah.
And if we want to produce certain outcomes for people that are not ourselves, both in terms of activities as well as emotive states, I mean, I would argue that's a kind of empathy. We actually are required to have empathy. And and not just like in the sense that we just absorb it and then we just kind of like have it be in us. More importantly, it guides our direction, right? It guides what we're doing, what we're producing. So there's that aspect of it, just on a professional level, working with for users, but also in the fact of when you have a work in progress, right? When you're working on something, I actually consider those work in progresses, those things as conversations. They're actual entities that have what's working, what's not, what's your intentions, what's the struggles. By you asking those questions and being empathetic to it, being open to it, not being so quick to solve the problem. Because a lot of times how you solve the problem does not have the full picture. Right. I mean, I've seen that many times in critiques where people look at something and go, okay, do this, this, and this, and this. And like they just give a prescription. Right. Which may be of value in the very, very beginning when students have no grasp of concept at all or any of the principles. But that should be done very mildly and only as a last resort. Far often, you need to grab at the principles first of what's being discussed here. Because usually, how you solve a problem via principles can go in many different directions based on the limitations and needs of the time. This is what I mean by these are ultimately empathetic points. Because that's the same point. When someone gets upset and you understand where they're coming from, you don't just understand they're upset. You understand why they're upset, what's the significance of it, and what limitations is actually causing them to be locked into this mode.
Exactly, yeah. And even then, is that what they're reacting to for what they're being upset about, is that the actual cause, or is that, and I've seen that in design too. It's like, I'm going to be really rudimentary with this one, but somebody will say, well, I'm doing a brochure. It's like, well, why are you doing a brochure when you actually get to the, to the essence of what is really being asked of this communication, it's a poster or whatever it might be. You know what I mean? So it's like, well,
yeah.
I'm just going with that knee-jerk reaction of this is what's causing me to make this choice. So,
Yeah.
but
Looking at symptoms instead of causes.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So that empathy and having that empathy makes us be more in tune to what's being asked of us. Is that kind of like a really shorter, if I had to put that in a sentence blurb, or would there be more to it? Yeah.
If you had to summarize it. Well, I think that's the first step, right?
Yeah.
But I think also a big part of it too is a lot of times we don't have all the answers. And we don't even need to have all the answers.
Right.
We just need awareness.
Awareness. I think that's great. And you're talking about the process and how in the process is where we need to have the empathy. It's where we need to be aware of what we're doing, because by the time we're done and we produce it, it's too late unless you redo and
people get very defensive, and it doesn't work because people get defensive, and then dialogues about finished things are really more position arguments. Like, this is the right answer, clearly, and then you're proposing a counter argument, and they're going to try to defeat you by saying, the limitations and all the other reasons means this is the right answer. So it's actually a kind of, it's kind of like a courthouse argument, right? Mm-hmm. As opposed to revealing a real truth of the matter. Like, it might reveal truth, but in a much more method of division, right? A method of destruction or breaking down versus bringing up, right?
Right. Yeah,
which is valid, but it has its place. It's not the full use.
And you're right, though. I've seen many final critiques, kind of go that route, right? Instead of really kind of getting to the root of things. So then, what are your thoughts then on this process? Because I know that's something that you mentioned to me prior as well.
Yeah. Well, I think a big part of it is, a very typical problem I think a lot of professors will point out is that students will do like one rendition of a direction, right? Maybe three if you really force them to go off the edge on it. Right. And I understand why, because they're thinking about efficiency of time and energy. So they don't want to, versus when I know professionally what happens a lot is you got to do, like when you're a junior designer at an agency or something, you're doing hundreds of directions. It's like a crazy order of magnitude different mode of working. But why? But the question you need to answer is why? Why is that? And why is the student not connecting what's going on here? Well, I think is ultimately the art world, we don't really work by deduction. It's not like we have a master plan and then we produce the result by deduction of figuring it out. No, we're inductive in our methods. We produce stuff and then we look at it. Does it work? And a lot of times we need actually work analogically, in the sense that we look at how this pairs with this, and then we need to see how that compares to this, right? We have these kind of comparisons, and we start making assessments like, okay, this is better than that. Right, and then you move on to the next variation, and then you start doing this test, and maybe you'll be a little more systematic eventually. But that's in terms of the process. What I'm getting at is we got to learn methods of dealing with multiplicity, randomness, the fact that, quite frankly, a lot of times it's chance we're dealing with here. Art loves chance, and chance loves art.
That's true.
As Aristotle comments, the arts are not a guaranteed perfection where all the time, when we do an activity, we get this perfect result the first time. Never happens. I've never heard a professional ever say that. And if we accept that, then that means our method of working as a process must be a deliberative kind of iteration. But iteration always thinks about it as a linear mode, right? You're just doing one direction. It's really more about pushing to the extremis, right? We need to take a position, and we got to push it as hard as we can in the other direction, and then maybe build in between. Or build two other extremas and then see how the system all relates with each other to find the right match that works. So in terms of process, that seems to be the mode I'm seeing that works, because students seem to get it once I get them to do that mode kind of thinking. Like, don't give me like 3 steps that are like super close. Give me the extreme modes.
Right. Exactly.
And then let's find the ones that work.
Yeah, I do struggle myself with that. If I say, come in next class with 6 different ideas, they've just, everything's still in a circle, but they've just put the type closer together, that type of answer. So I might tap into this come fall and see what I can do and see if I can get that variety. There's got to be some different exercises too that you can build on or apply to kind of get them to do the extremes. And that's something that I've been
you would have to
thinking
list
about.
attributes. So for example, composition, size, color, image, texture. Like you have to list the attribute that needs to be put in the extremes, right?
Yeah.
And you got to demonstrate what an extreme is. So show not this to this, this to this. Like it's gigantic. Like we need a very big movement, not small movements in the beginning. Right. And then as you get closer, you basically get smaller in the movement.
Yeah. So you've also mentioned the relationship to all this with science.
Yeah. Yeah. So I bring it up because the project I'm working on right now is like the perfect marrying of that. So it might be worth sinking into it because that's a big thing, right? It's like I can only talk about things I have authority or experience in.
Sure. Exactly. Yeah. Did you want to elaborate on that now, or do you want to? We can come back to that a little bit closer towards the end.
I mean, I'm fine either way. We're just flowing. It's fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, because you know what I say about science. So here's the thing about that. So when you ask about I kind of stopped myself about what we should add to the curriculum because I was like, I'm just keeping adding stuff. We're not talking about what we're moving. But here's the one thing I will claim we need to put in. I think statistical inference. I think statistical analysis. We have to understand the science of randomness and probabilities. I think that's ultimately a body of knowledge that we are interacting with. We're dealing with it all the time, but we actually don't have any knowledge of it. Like we don't actually understand the principles, properties behind it.
What would that? I like that. And I think I've had similar thoughts, but before I can say I've had similar thoughts, can you elaborate on that a little bit, that analysis? Yeah. Yeah, so there's a couple of routes. I mean, one is, just the basic points about what kind of data is there in the universe. Like, right, there's, if I remember correctly, there's categories, there's ordinals, there's integers, and then intervals or integers. And then there's ratios, right? Those are different kinds of data points. So just a question of what kind of data point we're talking about. As a thing too, so what I just said right there, notice what we're paying attention to. We're looking at how do we measure things and how do we have an effect on the world. So that's the first thing. It actually it's a radical mode of not even think of considering form for form's sake or design for its own sake, but towards its purpose. And when you're towards a purpose, how do you know you achieved the purpose? Yeah, you need to, that's the first point why you need statistical inference and analysis. I say inference too because that's not just that's including analysis, because inference allows you from a body of knowledge that you generated, you can infer things more, right? You can generalize, you can get to predictions. You have all these powers of knowledge that you gain from this power. Now it's not perfect, clearly, but it's certainly more powerful than an educated guess or gut instinct. So before I said about having a power that even a king will have to bend to. So if you know statistical inference and you can demonstrate that, okay, within here's the mean of the result this direction gave me, and here's the distribution of it. I know from the sample we can extrapolate to this population, this probability within this range. This is what's going to happen. That's a lot more confident to a stakeholder who has money down the line than saying, okay, I think this is really cool looking. It's not going to, they're going to go that. If you use blue, it'll be perfect. Yeah. And by the way, this is way more robust than just doing an A/B test. Like that's another thing too, is that because we're not involved, we don't have that knowledge. We don't even have the power to challenge on the outside when we're subjected to A/B testing. So if you go into UX and all those other environments where A/B testing is aggressively used, here's the problem. What variables do you vary? The designer should be the one to decide that, no one else, because design is interrelations, and which relation is a significant relation change. Only a designer can answer that, because it's by proportional ratios, not because versus some engineer, they have no idea. They can change the font by 1 point. When's it significant? We would be able to answer that question, not them, for example. But we can't even answer those questions. We can't even challenge them, because we don't even have the tool set of statistical analysis and inference to make the argument. I like that. Yeah. If we can get our students thinking about that sooner, maybe they'll be able to talk about the purpose behind what they've created and have a better success rate at and that's exactly the point, that point right? So instead of success being the grade I give you as a professor, Yeah.
The success is, did you get the outcome? Did you win? Did you get victory?
Yes.
Because that's what the world really cares about. Education is really great because it gives us a safe bin, like a little playground to just mess around and not pay consequences severely for it. But Peter, we both live in the adult world. It's not how it works. When there's, especially at the higher magnitudes, hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars at stake, you can't mess around. You can't experiment. Like that's why when people complain about sameness in design or stagnation or regularization. Well, because they're ignoring the limitations being imposed onto them of risk. You have risk exposure, and you're going to need tools to get around the risk exposure. And statistical inference and analysis is one of the tools we need to use to achieve that. And remind the student that just because you got 100 in your school does not mean you're going to get 100 in life. That's not how it works,
that's
dude.
True. Yeah. I have students all the time like, well, how do I get an A on this project? And I was like, forget about the grade. Yeah, that's the first thing you need to do is forget about the grade. And then we talk about, that, and that's my least favorite thing about being an educator is you have to put some numerical value onto the work they've done. Yeah.
I think it has value. I mean, here's the thing. I agree, right? Because of that problem you just pointed out. The test then, like the examination becomes corrupted in the sense that everyone is trying to game the system to get the score as opposed to actual success that grade was meant to demonstrate.
To the point of asking the professor, what do I need to do, to
get my grade. I run into it all the time. That's why I love this idea of we grounded this to actual metric results. Like if your job was to make a poster and get people to attend the event, if no one came to the event, you failed.
Yeah. Interesting.
I love that idea. I have so much protesting from my students on that one, but
I think it's a scary thing too, because just trying to get people to come to an event in itself is a challenge.
Do you know how hard that is? Like see, that's the thing too, right? It like grounds you into the reality of existence, and it's so both incredibly challenging yet so beautiful when you achieve victory. Like it actually makes you appreciate real victory. Because it actually shows that you actually have a power, that you actually did something in the world when before you didn't. And I think it's a very powerful thing. And by the way, you can make the 6 really small. You could just make it a club, like the Graphic Design Club after school. Hey, make it smaller so you're not doing like a gig poster for some rock band or something like down the street. Do it within the school university community. You can definitely do it. I've been definitely meditating on that as new modes of curriculum in my mind already. I don't have that kind of authority yet as an adjunct, but I think that would be a radical different way of teaching because it makes it really ground to some external energy, external reality that's not the professor per se, but it still gives you the force of number. And number is very powerful because numbers have an effect. It's no different when I watch my weight by scaling myself.
Right. And
when I see I tipped over a little much, I'm going to take it a little easy subconsciously in my snacks and all that day or week, So numbers definitely have a power, but the problem is they can be easily gamed if not done the right manner.
Yeah. Speaking of numbers, I'm going to ask you maybe a little bit impromptu or off script, but on script question. Yeah. Okay. How's that for an ambiguous lead in?
That's fine.
Do you see, are you getting, so the foundation question, print versus digital, I've asked this a lot. But with the discussion we're having, does that fit into the context? How does that fit into typography? How does that fit into the work that you're doing? And is it affecting your teaching?
Oh, totally. Well, I guess on the first point, in terms of print versus web, I mean, naturally there's it's a little easier because we've just been kind of trained into print. It's just kind of a given. So it's a little bit easier. And if your priority is type 1, then you just listen, your priority is to get the students to understand the concepts and principles, right? In the mode, you don't, it's not prudent to dump them with a digital question when they're still learning the principles in the first place. I get it. Yeah. Just on the practicalities of teaching. Like you don't want to sit there and have to go over what CSS and HTML is and all that. But I got to say, there are capacities that the web experience are just fundamentally different from print. There's a grain to the web and a certain way of working that only working on the web is going to give you. So I'm also not in the camp of just saying make mock-ups and just slap it back and forth. Because first of all, I'm going to challenge you practically on that. When you give that to an engineer or someone else to convert into actual code, they're going to do whatever they want. And I guarantee you, they're not going to have the nuance to know that, no, you're letting your line height at this degree is totally not the right one. Like, you think you could just round up to the full unit versus to the decimal point? No way, dude. You get back to those decimals. I'm just being honest. Like, 'cause they can just take whatever, just round up because they're too much an abstraction. And they're thinking too much is just like this entity from the outside versus a whole existence that designers are been trained to look at as a whole. That's on that side of the issue. On the other side, there's totally capacities and activities that the web can do that we've not even tapped into. I really don't believe that. That is, by type not being so tightly bound to the web, I almost want like almost a separate curriculum for the web type discussion. Because because once those principles are understood and that could be explored and expanded on, we could produce really amazing, crazy things with that. Not just in a raw aesthetic experience, but really in a function experience, like in terms of activities. And doing these that only the web experience can do. And by the way, you can easily tie them both together, in different ways. So one of my favorite examples, is the idea of like personalized printouts that you give to people, right? So the idea of using technology to personalization combined with print. I've seen advertising people do it all the time. It's very effective because it applies on the principle that what do people care about? Themselves. So when you give communications tailored to them and a personalized manner they can hold in their hands, it's very valuable. It's true in print and web too, but there's certain things about it in hand that are also very powerful. Like I've done as a gift, I did that. Like a typeface I was producing, I asked for people to give me their favorite word and I typeset it out. And I wrote a note in the back. That was done about 3-4 years ago. People still have it in their offices, like hung.
Oh yeah, that's great.
That's so much superior than an email that would have been blown away in 10 seconds, or some just junk mail promotional piece would have been, again, junk mailed completely.
Yeah, that's an interesting analogy to think about it. And I mean, once you've said it, I'm like, oh yeah, duh, that makes sense. But people will hold on to things that are actual things they can hold and look at, hang on their wall, as opposed to that digital thing that kind of gets lost in all the other digital things and just filed as data somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, a similar analogy in books.
How long do you go back and look at that stuff,
Yeah, it's a similar analogy to books. I love physical books. I have books both in audiobook, PDF, and print because there are certain times I need that serendipitous, like, wait, I grab the book and then I go through it really quickly, right? And I see my margin notes of what I said the last time I reviewed the note, right? Like, I don't have, it's too fluid in the other environments. Or I'll listen to an audiobook and pick up, oh, that's really good. What chapter is that? And I need to go back later to read it. So it's really more instead of, I think other people have said this before, right? In the sense that it's not really like one or the other. It's just that there's a kind of multiplicity that's occurring, which has its own problems because people, again, are limited in time and resources. And it's like chronically the big problem of human existence. It's like, we just want to be told the one thing. We want to do like the one thing that's going to make our lives awesome. But that never is the case. It's always, even if there
just
is.
Give us the answer. Yeah.
Yeah. Or just like, give us the answer. That's one motive, but also just like doing this one activity is going to do it. When it's never the case. Like at best, there's one principle, but how that principle gets expressed is through a diversity.
Exactly.
That's a big kind of downer in reality. Like you don't get the coast because the world has an inherent diversity. Yet at the same time, not like it doesn't have any unities or any kind of groundingness that we can grab at. Right. So you can't just be like, whatever, it's all irrelevant. It's all just not, it's just noise. It has no significance at all.
Cause and effect. Yeah. Yeah. I have a good friend back in Indiana. She teaches at Purdue, and I'm constantly, hi Jesse, constantly reaching out to her and saying, hey, have they solved this for the web yet? Have they solved this for the digital environment, screen devices? Like hyphenation and individual letter kerning and different things like that. And she's like, well, they're working on things. Things are getting closer. It's coming, And I'm like, oh, we just need to get it right now, So yeah, we want that one solution and just move on with it. But it's so hard to get there. What are you working on now one that you can talk about, right?
Yeah.
and TypeCon's coming up. I'm gonna miss TypeCon again.
So am I.
Boy, yeah. The toughest thing for a full-time educator is the scheduled date.
Yeah, because I guess your class is the end of August too, right?
Yeah.
Yep, same thing.
Yep. So first day of class, you don't want to just not be there.
Literally, first day I've done in past years at TypeCon, I would fly right from TypeCon right to my class, like with suitcase.
Oh,
I would have it prepared. I would my syllabus and all that ready to go. So I would just roll in from the airport with my suitcase into the class.
Oh God!
Yeah, for that 8 a.m. class.
That's aggressive. Yeah. So I'm going to miss that. But yeah, what are you working on? Any conferences coming up? What is Tom doing in Tom's world?
Tom's world? I mean, the major project, type design related, that I'm working on is a variable font for improving reading proficiency. So this was supported by Google, and I gave a talk about it at ICE Type in Istanbul, the public presentation of it. So long story short, this is actually why podcasts matter a lot. It was through a podcast. I think you've had to guess Diane before.
Oh, okay,
yeah.
Sure.
It was
Design Recharge?
Yes. So through her podcast, what happened was a researcher discovered me, my background, what I was doing, and for the last 20 years, she's an educational therapist who just completed her PhD in education. Basically, worked with students who were struggling readers, and to give you context within that discipline, the paradigm basically it was like a cognition problem. Like there's something wrong with the student's brain, or there's something wrong in the teaching method. So it's either the teacher or the student that's the problem. Seems reasonable. I mean, that's the thesis. And there have been many attempts to try to solve this problem, right? Change the content, invest more in teacher training, all this other stuff, but didn't work very well. Not very good results. Bonnie Schaefer-Troop, that's the researcher in question.
Okay.
She came up with the thesis 20 years ago. Wait a minute. But they're all looking at type. They're looking at the text on paper. Maybe it's the environment that's causing the problem. In this case, the environment in this case, it's not the people, it's the environment. It's what's called typographic factors. Type.
Okay.
That's how the type is set. That's basically, that was her thesis. So she just, again, no training background in type, went through and started experimenting what interventions could help improve reading proficiency. And reading proficiency, just to give you context, is broken into 3 parts: decoding, fluency, and comprehension.
Okay.
Decoding is you can basically see symbols and convert them into sounds. Fluency is be able to do so very comfortably without any effort, like riding a bike. You know, when you first ride a bike, it's really awkward. You're over-processing. You're straining a lot. But over time, it just becomes second nature to you, right? It's still the same activity, just your mental load on it is much easier. And then comprehension is the ability to convert that conversion into understanding, right? So and the point is that you actually need the more fundamental properties to get the higher level ones. So to have fluency, you need decoding. If you want comprehension, you need fluency and decoding, right? So it's a channel link going one direction. Okay, so I didn't want to dump it all in one shot, so I just want to make sure we're good so far. So long story short, the biggest problem struggling readers have once they have decoding, they can see letters and convert into sounds, is doing so comfortably. And what Bonnie found when she talked to me, from she's done numerous practice with her students and studies, when she talked on the phone about it, she said, Thomas, if we expand the white space inside the letters and between the letters, we can affect the fluency, the ease of which a reader is able to read the text. And I heard that, and I instantly grasped it. I was like, of course, yeah. If the white space is too cramped or not right fit, it's not going to work. Type's going to be hard to read. Like that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
So I immediately grasped it. And I was kind of quite frankly dumbstruck that a researcher from education realized that point. You know, so I was like, well, go on.
Yeah. Does this affect our ascenders and descenders? Is it an X height thing, or is it just the condensed versus extended?
I mean, clearly properties like X height, right? Specifically, X height probably is a relevant factor, I'd imagine. Also, a big one is actually contrast, is a massive one as well, right? So you need a low contrast form. The researchers have a controversial point about serifs, right? So they argue the serifs are hindering versus aiding in legibility. So that's or fluency. So that's a controversial point. I I think a more reasonable claim is it's contrast, right? So basically high contrast faces are not conducive to good fluency. It makes sense because that's again an issue of white space. It's too much. Wow. It's too much white compared to black in certain areas.
How far along has this research come so far?
So what's happened is, she's been doing for 20 years in independent studies of sample sizes of about ranging from like 20 to 15 over numerous periods of time, getting the same results through this process. So here's the thing. So when she talked to me about it, the major revelation or major point about it is that it's not like it's like one setting solved the problem. No, it's a degree of increasing intensity. So you start at a relatively tight fit, and then you show basically as a family, right, increasing modes of intensity of more and more white space, both inside and between the letters. So think of it basically the typeface becoming expanded and tracked out at the same time. You can think of it that way.
Okay.
Right? And here's the thing. It's not like one setting solved was perfect for everybody. It had distribution. Some people did better with say, Times New Roman in the control versus the series. But even within the series, some people did best at the really tight fitting. Some did best at the second level, third level, fourth level, fifth level, sixth, for example.
Okay.
So, go on.
No, so I'm thinking, so your variable typeface, is it going to be then intended to work in a digital? Like, are they reading print to get?
Yeah. So there's two parts of that. Part one was I heard all this. I was like, wait a minute. So these are static, distinct elements, right? Basically movements between the different family. She's like, yes. I was like, well, dude, this could be a variable font because to give the analogy, this is basically, well, wait a minute. If we're saying that we could find the optimal fit for the reader, right? And it's not the same for everybody, and it's within a certain range. Well, what's to say that say within a certain study, 9 people did the best result with this setting? Who's to say some people need something a little more towards this level, a little less, and some people need a little more, like eyeglasses. Eyeglasses are not, first of all, one setting of eyeglass for everybody. But even then, they have a range of options, right? It's not like you get 6 eyeglasses and that's it. Everybody's got to use the same eyeglass. Or there's 6. That's it. That's all your choices are. So the variable font technology allows for versus discrete selection, continuous selection. So you can get down to the second decimal point degree of optimal fit for our user. Right. And so that was the major revolution I saw from that point. So we produced basically I pitched this to Google. They said, go for it. It sounds really promising. Do the project and produce the study to demonstrate it. So that's what we did.
Oh, fantastic.
We produced the fonts, we produced the study. Yeah. Subject of 20 students. And we demonstrated that 17 out of 19 did better with Lexan, and it followed a distribution of Gaussian in nature, bell curvy, basically in nature, around a certain setting, but but even the one that had the median result, right? The highest number for Lexan, for that setting of Lexan was not a majority.
Now is that a sans serif or a serif typeface?
Sans serif.
Sans serif.
And the control was Times New Roman.
Okay, because I was going to ask, is there in this variable typeface an extent of serif to sans serif?
No, it wasn't considered the essential metric.
Yeah. Would that be something for future research? I mean, I wonder what that would...
This is exactly why we need designers in research, because we have to frame the question. That's the whole point.
Exactly.
I mean, an educator ain't going to know about the difference, or why it would be significant if it's serif versus not. But in general...
I mean, if we look at Cooper Black... You know, the serifs on Cooper Black are more like these little wedges, if you will, little spurs, you know, but is that still considered, you know, a serif typeface? To
be honest, I mean, probably in the research, the general position is that those serifs are accidental. They're not the essential quality. No, I mean, that's huge, because a lot of people have been told that it's the serifs, like by default, serif type, always in body copy. When the research has shown that's not true. It's not like, it's not like my personal position. We don't have the research to back it up. It's not the serifs hurt you per se. It's really more the contrast that's the question. So a low contrast is the essential. That's my point. See the difference? One, you're kind of
trying to read Palatino body copy. It's like, ooh, that's a rough one, but it works. But it all depends on its context, its setting, and all kinds of other variables. But
going on.
which will maybe bore a lot of readers, but just make us super excited to talk about for hours.
For hours and hours. But the point is, so One is that there's a multiplicity of need, right? And one font ain't going to solve the problem. So it's you're going to need a method of delivery that serves a diverse population. So you need a tool of measurement, which we have. I didn't go into the math or the specifics of fluency, how it's measured. That's on. We can share a link to everybody to check that out because.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, let's do that.
I don't want to bore people with those particulars. But the point is, that's actually rather important because in the past, a lot of times font choices are allowed as accommodation within special ed, for example, but it's always based on preference. So it's like, the subject said this was they preferred it. But that's not a metric. Like that's just a subjective opinion. That's not, you actually had a better fluency score with this font versus the other. And we demonstrated that is the case. So for example, in the study, the average was 110 words correct per minute for Times New Roman. With Lexan, it was 128.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly. So it's about 20% improvement.
Yeah. With that in mind, I'm going to ask you this one question. I think then we'll wrap up our discussion today, but we'll get you back on the podcast to talk more about how this project is developed. That'd be great.
Yes.
You're mentioning opinion and how it just why we have the amount of typefaces we have, because not everything works for every situation or for every person. Eric Gill once said, "There are as many typefaces as there are fools." If you could speak to Eric Gill today, what would you say to him about that comment?
I would say he's right in one sense, right, when it's not guided by good reasoning. So that's absolutely correct. But in another way, he's wholly wrong because human beings have different needs, right? And the question is, it's kind of like instead of a kind of virtue in a sense of optimal fit, right? To be optimally fit for the environment. The presumption always was the human being had to change to fit onto the environment. But the paradigm we're looking at is instead, how can we make the environment fit to the person? And we have the technology to do so now. And by the way, I'd love to come on again and talk more about this because the implications of this research and the production we're doing are gigantic. Because if we actually understand this paradigm of fitting typography to users in a way that's measurable and by reasoning, that's good. It doesn't just stop with the type. It goes into the layout, the images used, the composition, all these other things. So it actually takes not even variable font, and flexible typography, the discussions by Tim Brown, for example, and things like that. Those are all based on the idea of either random axes being discussed, subjectively selected, or the viewport determining what content is presented in what way. What if instead, or in addition to that, it was for the user, for the optimal fit for them?
Yeah.
That is beyond just a preference per se, but also for optimal fit. So it's actually like the next level of like almost if-then conditional typography, right?
Yep.
Because that's the thing, is that if we understand there's a range, you can't just make one solution that solves all the problems. Because as you said, there's a diversity of need. But what you can do is build a relation of extremes. We know within a certain population will solve these problems. And that's the thing, I think a lot of times when we think about that, people go on and go, well, whatever, we have no standards. We'll have no reasoning behind it. It'll just be like, a good example when you have text that, say, a Wikipedia, the text measure goes all the way across the edge. No matter how big your screen is, the measure just goes forever. Because I think people kind of have they put their hands up and go, whatever, we can't solve this problem, so whatever. No, I think we can. I think at a certain level, we're actually going to have a level of power on the typography to create optimal fit for not just viewports, but also for what that user needs. So what is the right measure for them? What is the right line height? What's the right margin relationships? All those are conditionals based on relations. So all you got to do is just understand those and build a map as kind of mapping between the extremes and let interpolation work out things in between instead.
Yeah,
so
that's an excellent.
Basically, you design twice. You design basically the two extremes for the purpose you're aiming for, and you let interpolation or inference work on everything in between. And you use data to verify your points. So when you know you're wrong, if your measurements are wrong, you demonstrate the case, you adjust as needed, and you get the best result.
That's fantastic, and that's a big part of my pedagogy is in a lot of my discussions. We're in a humanistic revolution. It's about us as human beings and what our needs are, and which is why I've actually used Eric Gill as that example. One, because he doesn't believe in having a whole bunch of typefaces. But two, his answer, his solution was a humanistic solution. Gil Sans was meant to find a softer way, a more humanistic way to relate the letter form. So,
Yeah, but unfortunately misguided because he thought the one solution was going to solve the problem. So he was wrong. He was faulting his reasoning in that.
Right.
Plus,
he
also,
didn't have the integers. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, plus, not the best person. Not the best person. The best moral character. I don't really need to go into those details.
We'll let our viewers and listeners do the research on that. And get those answers. Thomas, it's been a lot of fun. I had a great conversation, and we'll get you back on the podcast to talk about some of the results from that research and that variable typeface you're working on.
Absolutely.
It sounds exciting.
Also, I know I'm very excited about it. We have a lot of great things happening next year too with it. So more to talk about.
That'll be super. And like we said, we'll leave some links for everyone in the description, both on the podcast, online on my website, as well as on YouTube, so people will be able to check all that out. I've had a great time catching up with you. It's been too long, and I hope the next time isn't as long. So
I agree, Peter. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
You bet. Yeah, it was a pleasure having you on the podcast. All right. Take care, Thomas. See you. Bye. Thank you for joining me on this episode. The Designed Podcast website is located at thedesignpodcast.com. There you can find notes on the episode, links to our guests, links to resources, and more regarding the many things discussed during each show. If you find the Design Podcast interesting and informative, please subscribe on Apple Podcast or on your favorite podcast service. You can also follow the Design Podcast on Instagram and Facebook, and subscribe to our video version of the podcast on YouTube. Please join us for the next episode of the Design Podcast, and let's continue to create success in design education.